Hello, this is the second video for the week before spring break, kind of making up for our absence due to the virus. So what I'm going to ask you to do, I'm sending out an email to everyone this morning also. It's Tuesday morning of the week before spring break. And in that email, I'm asking you to watch these first two videos, the gospel introduction video and then this one, and to email me with questions you might have, points that maybe you'd like to have clarified or hear a little bit more about. And then I'd like to take those questions before making the third video of the week, which will probably then get posted around Thursday or Friday morning. So if you could watch these two and jot down just one or two questions and respond to my email with questions and whatnot that you might have, we'll go from there, and that'll help build the third video for the week, and I'll also add some content. So want to take up where we left off with the last video, which was talking about the synoptic gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and want to do a little kind of overview of some basic themes that are in all three. Well, these three gospels have a lot in common, as we said in the last video, but they also have some distinctives, right? And so I want to give you some themes that sort of separate them from one another. And these, I want to stress, these are not totally true. For example, I'm going to suggest that Matthew is typically viewed as kind of the most Jewish of the three synoptic gospels, that it really emphasizes Jesus' connection with Jewish history, with the Jewish story, and the Torah and teaching, and Jesus acts much more like a rabbi in Matthew. Now, that's not to say that he doesn't do those things in Mark and Luke, and that there's not any evidence of that whatsoever. But that's a huge theme in Matthew. It kind of stands out in Matthew as opposed to the other two. So, and that's going to be true for each of the distinctives that I'm going to suggest. It's not that you can't find evidence of the same thing in Matthew or Mark or Luke, depending on which one we're talking about, but it's just that these are things that kind of separate them. So I want to start with Mark. I'm just going to do a quick summary of some of the ways scholars and readers of these three Gospels often think of them in somewhat different ways from one another. And then we're going to look at a couple ideas called the Messianic Secret and the Messianic Expectation, and then talk about a third idea called Christology, and that may kind of fill up the time that we have for this video. And if we have a little bit of extra time, we'll start looking at a little bit of material from the Gospel of Mark if we don't run out of time during this. So the first summary statement I want to start with is Mark. So we're gonna be working under the assumption that Mark is the first gospel, that Mark in priority is correct. So we're gonna, in this lecture, going to start with Mark, and then go to Matthew and Luke, and then following this, when we actually start digging into the Gospels, we're going to spend a lecture or two in Mark before moving on to look at Matthew for a little while, and then Luke for a little while, and then finally turn to John. Okay, so one of the things that people notice about Mark is obviously it's shortest. It's the shortest of the Gospels by far. And one of the interesting reasons that it's shortest is it tells nothing about Jesus' birth or childhood. If you're familiar with, Christmas stories of angels and shepherds and three wise men coming to the manger and all that kind of stuff, those are not in Mark. Those are from Matthew and Luke. And we'll look at which stories go in which Gospels. But none of that is in Mark. Mark starts with Jesus as an adult. Mark seems to have no interest whatsoever in telling us where Jesus comes from. He just jumps in with Jesus as an adult, and things get moving. And that's kind of a theme that carries out through Mark. So one of the things that you'll notice if you pay attention in reading Mark is everyone is in a hurry. And that's indicated in Mark's language and also just the movement of the story. So, right, like Mark doesn't want to mess around with Jesus' childhood. He just wants to get going with things that happen to Jesus as an adult. And then once that starts, action moves very quickly. And this shows up even in English. You'll see often kind of language like something will happen, and then the very next day Jesus goes here, and then right away he traveled to the next city, and then immediately he did this other thing. So you have the sense that in Mark that Jesus rarely takes a rest. There's not any kind of leisurely, and then Jesus stayed in this community for a week or two and talked to a lot of people and did some things and maybe took some time off and visited with friends. No, he's just moving, 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 right? And so one of the questions people have is why? Why does Mark have Jesus be in such a hurry, right? Like what is he in a hurry to get to? Why is he moving so quickly from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next? And that goes to a second theme in Mark, that Mark, more than any other gospel, really, really focuses on the death of Jesus, the last week of Jesus's life. So in kind of church history and in academics, but really just even in the history of the church, the last week of Jesus's life, or the death of Jesus, is also often called the Passion. So, so a passion narrative is when a gospel tells the story of Jesus's death, and typically that starts a week before, on what in church history is often called Palm Sunday, which we'll talk about more later. This kind of Jesus arriving in Jerusalem to begin the week of Passover, the Jewish Passover celebration. And he's greeted with crowds that wave palms and lay them down on the dusty road to kind of settle the dust, so that Jesus arrives in Jerusalem kind of like a king. So any gospel that has the story of Jesus's last week, that is called a passion narrative. Right, so a passion narrative is the story of Jesus' death, or the story of the events that lead up to Jesus' death. Now, all of the Gospels, I want to stress this, every single Gospel devotes more time to this week and more time to that event, Jesus' death, than any other event, right? So in all four Gospels, the Passion is a significant emphasis. In Mark, however, that is particularly so. Partly because he doesn't do anything with Jesus' birth, and he does very little bit with the resurrection. Jesus does rise from the dead in Mark, but we don't hear much about what happens afterwards. Partly because of that, and partly because Mark gives us very little of Jesus' teaching. Fully one third of the book of Mark is the last week of Jesus' life. It's kind of like he's sprinting. He's in a hurry to get somewhere, and then Jesus arrives at Jerusalem and everything slows to almost a halt, right? Like fully one third of the words in the book of Mark are words that are used to talk about Jesus' death, or the immediate events right before his death. So part of this hurry seems to be, well, Jesus is in a hurry to get to Jerusalem. And he's in a hurry to get to Jerusalem because that's where he's going to die. And so a theme for Mark is this theme of hurry, of constant movement, of I don't have time to sit and tell you about what Jesus said, because we're on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and really to the main thing, which is the death of Jesus. So a phrase that is used for Mark sometimes is that Mark is a passion narrative with a long introduction. Okay, and so what that means is, rather than being a story of Jesus' life, a biography of Jesus' life that happens to include the passion or happens to include the death, it's really as if, no, really what Mark primarily wanted to tell us was that Jesus died on the cross. And he tells us enough introductory information to give us some idea who Jesus is, but really his is a passion narrative more than it is a story of Jesus' entire life. And all the preceding stuff is almost just is merely an introduction. Now that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but it might be a helpful phrase to just help you think about how Mark builds his story, builds his theme, that it's a passion narrative with a long introduction. Okay, so an additional kind of couple themes that go with that. One is people are confused in Mark. Okay, Jesus' followers, his closest followers, these people that are called the disciples, kind of people that he is mentoring, or they're in an apprenticeship with Jesus of sorts. They're confused. We looked a little bit at that last night with the story of Jesus walking on water, right? Jesus climbs in the boat at the end of that story, and the disciples don't understand what happened because their hearts are hard. And that gets repeated, that idea gets repeated over and over again in Mark. Jesus will do something amazing. He will perform a miracle. He will say something remarkable. He will do something remarkable. And people are amazed. They're not apathetic to Jesus, but they're confused. They're kind of troubled and don't understand. But we understand. Like, one of the interesting things about Mark is that Mark tells the reader immediately who Jesus is, right? And we're going to come back to that in a minute. But Mark begins by saying, this is the story of Jesus, who was the Christ, right? And that is not, Christ is not Jesus' last name, like Steve Sherwood. It's not Jesus Christ. His parents weren't Joseph Christ and Mary Christ. Christ is a title, right? Christ is a kind of a political and religious title, like Jesus is king. Jesus is Lord. And so Mark tells us, the reader, right away, like, I want you to know who Jesus is. He's the Christ. But then he proceeds to tell a story where nobody else really understands that. I mean, even people that kind of guess at it get it wrong. And we're going to talk about that too. That's related to this messianic expectation and secret that we're going to hit on in a moment. So Jesus is in a hurry in Mark. People are very confused by him. The crowds follow him, are drawn to him, but they're also kind of disturbed by him and confused by him. Jesus is sort of upsetting in the Gospel of Mark. And then also, not only is Jesus headed to the cross, but he will repeatedly say things to the effect that if you want to be one of my followers, you need to be willing to go to the cross too. So part of the unsettledness or disturbingness of Jesus' gospel in the Gospel of Mark is this sense of part of why we were freaked out by him is he called us to die. He called us to be willing to die. So I've written out those three themes a little bit. So Jesus is in a hurry, everyone is confused, and kind of this idea of, can you follow me to the cross as well? So those are three ideas that kind of stand out in Mark. Now, again, want to stress there's elements of those ideas in the other Gospels as well, but they're particularly true in the Gospel of Mark. So just a quick summary, couple summary comments about Matthew. Matthew is often called the most Jewish of the Gospels. Okay, in Matthew, Jesus is very clearly, the author of Matthew goes to great effort to stress how Jewish Jesus is. There's a story of his relatives, a list of all of his relatives at the beginning, and we'll look at that more in a later lecture. But the list it highlights key people and events in the Jewish story and then tells us how Jesus is related to them. It starts with Abraham, and then it goes to David, and then it goes to the Babylonian exile, and then it goes to Jesus. And the author, right out of the gate in Matthew, is saying, if you want to understand who Jesus is, you need to know the Jewish story and understand his place in the Jewish story, and that he's here to fulfill the whole story of the Old Testament. And so often in Matthew, you have these, Jesus will do something, and then the author will say, this happened to fulfill this prophecy from the Old Testament. But even without those kind of clear telegraphing statements that Jesus is tying into this Old Testament prophecy, even without that, it's just clear that Jesus functions as a Jewish rabbi. He spends a ton of time interacting with this group, the Pharisees, that we mentioned in class last week. These folks, these Jews that are very, very hyper concerned with sort of being sure to follow Torah as best as they possibly can. And Jesus in Matthew spends a lot of time talking with them. He interacts with Pharisees in other Gospels too, but in Matthew there's a lot of that. And so you have the sense that Jesus is kind of a Jewish rabbi who's putting forth kind of an alternative interpretation of Torah. You have heard it said in Torah, this and that, or other rabbis have said this about the law, but I say this. and that's kind of a Matthew. That's how Jesus talks in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. Like, here is my alternative interpretation, but interpretation of the law. So Jesus in Matthew is very concerned with what he is doing, where first century Jews are in relation to the Jewish story from the past, in relation to Torah and how to follow Torah. You also, as I said, get these kind of prophetic sort of things. Jesus's role, we have more of Jesus's teaching in Matthew than we do in any other gospel. He also performs miracles. He also dies on the cross, just as he does in Mark. But in Matthew, you get a big sense of Jesus often slows down and either tells stories, parables, that are meant to teach the crowd, teach his disciples, or gives full-on sermons. And so in Matthew, Jesus looks a lot more like a rabbi. In Mark, he maybe looks a little bit like a revolutionary. But in Matthew, he looks quite a bit like a rabbi. And so that's a distinctive thing. So Matthew is kind of the Jewish gospel, the Torah gospel, the connection. Where does Jesus fit in this Jewish story? And that's really important for us in the 21st century as Christians to think about. We often think that Jesus is somehow a Christian, that Jesus came to specifically start a new religion. Now, Jesus is the person around whom Christianity is built. So in that sense, Jesus does start a new religion because his followers, interpreting who Jesus was and what he meant, eventually leave Judaism and start Christianity. But Jesus himself does not seem to have had any interest in doing that. Jesus himself seems to be very concerned or interested in fulfilling Judaism. That he sees himself not as a replacement to Judaism or not kind of throwing out the Jewish faith, but more fulfilling it or bringing it to its completion. And that's really stressed in Matthew. So Matthew is this kind of particularly sort of Jewish gospel. And so I wrote that out as well, but that's pretty simple. I mean, that he is not a non-Jewish teacher. He's not replacing or rejecting Judaism. He's seeing himself within it, and he sees himself as fulfilling Torah. Luke is a different gospel altogether in some senses. Again, they're synoptic enough that there's a ton of very common material. So in highlighting these differences, I'm not trying to make stark differences, but there are some distinct themes. So one of the themes in Luke that is significant is Luke. You find Jesus being very concerned, and this happens immediately. And we'll look at this in 2 or 3 lectures from now, eventually, when we turn to Luke. Luke, even at the night of Jesus' birth, the Gospel of Luke highlights the way that Jesus interacts with outsiders, right? So if you think of who in society has power or who has prestige, and in Jewish society, that would be the politically connected or the rich, as well as the religiously connected. So Pharisees, priests at the temple, the rich, the powerful, King Herod and whatnot. And who does Jesus appear to on the night of, who do the angels appear to on the night of Jesus' birth in Luke? Not to any of those people. Angels announce Jesus' birth to these poor shepherds, these Amharets. And we're going to spend more time looking at that story particularly. But that sets in motion a theme that continues throughout Luke. Whether it's poor people, women, because this is a very patriarchal society where women are often kind of marginalized, particularly in public, a rabbi would not talk to women in a public setting, and yet Jesus does. And does kind of repeatedly in the Gospel of Luke. Samaritans, remember those half-breed Jews that kind of come up in conquest of the north. So they're very much looked down upon by purebred Jews in the south. And Jesus talks quite a bit with Samaritans. He also talks with Gentiles. So any group that kind of Jewish insiders or Jewish elite would have looked down on, the poor, women, Gentiles, Samaritans, the Gospel of Luke over and over again shows Jesus kind of paying particular attention to those groups, right? If you think all the way back, to Genesis, right? where God sees Hagar and looks upon Hagar and rescues her and rescues Ishmael, even though they're not really in the Jewish story, right? They're outsiders to, in some ways, to the covenant that God has made with Abraham. God still sees them. And I told you then, like, that's going to be that's an important idea in the Bible. This God notices the outsiders. Well, in Luke, that's particularly true. Of all four Gospels, in Luke, you get the largest sense that Jesus is quite concerned with people on the outside. So, those are a handful of kind of themes that separate the three synoptic Gospels. Now, John has altogether different themes, but it's such a different Gospel. We're going to look at it kind of separately. Right now, we're just sort of comparing and contrasting the three synoptic Gospels. Okay, so before we move into looking a little bit at Mark specifically, want to talk about two ideas, one of which we've already alluded to, which is this idea of the messianic expectation. Okay, so I've written that down, messianic expectation. So if you grew up at all in church and in American Christianity, I think we have a natural tendency to think that the Messiah clearly was going to be God. You know, the Jews somehow always expected God to come to earth and to die on the cross so that they could go to heaven when they die, because that's what we think of as Jesus. You know, like that Jesus is our Messiah and that he is God in the flesh who came to save us from our sins so that we don't have to go to hell and we can go to heaven. And there's a good bit of truth to that, but that is almost certainly not what first century Jews thought the Messiah was going to be. So all the way back to at least Isaiah, right? You know, at least beginning in Isaiah, if not further forward, you have examples of, the Jews expecting somebody that was going to come, expecting a deliverer, expecting a prophet that was going to come. God was going to send someone to rescue them, and that this would be a chosen one or an anointed one or a Messiah, right? But they were not expecting that the Messiah would be God himself. Okay, so one of the things that is almost certainly true of the Jewish messianic expectation is that they did not think that it would be God in the flesh. Like, that's kind of a plot twist, as it were, a fairly significant one. They're thinking it's going to be somebody maybe like Moses, somebody maybe like David. You know, that God sends a king who's going to fight battles, and rescue them, particularly from the Roman Empire and in the first century. That Rome is oppressing them. Rome has kind of taken away their religious freedom, and that God is going to send someone who will deliver them, rescue them. And so their expectation has been building for centuries, right? Because first Babylon, then Assyria, then Greece, then Rome, one empire after another has kind of dominated them and oppressed them. And sometimes more, the Persians were a little bit gentler than the Babylonians and better than the Greeks. But they've not been free for hundreds of years, right? For hundreds of years, Jews have, even when they get to return to Jerusalem, have been frustrated, deeply, deeply frustrated by the fact that they can't really worship God freely and they can't rule themselves. They're ruled by these other nations. So by the time Jesus comes, there's kind of this turmoil within Judaism of, when is this going to happen? When is God going to deliver us? And so they're kind of constantly looking around for signs that surely God's not going to let us suffer much longer. Because Rome is this awful empire oppressing us, and at any moment God is going to send someone. So when Jesus starts to perform miracles and display power and gather a following of people, there's this expectation, right, that maybe he is the one. And not that he's maybe the one that's going to come and forgive us from our sins, but maybe he's the one who's going to come and kick Rome's ass. He's going to take a sword and he's going to drive out the Roman armies, and then he's going to sit down on the throne in Jerusalem. And it's going to be like the good old days. It's going to be like David and Solomon all over again. And the nation will rise back to glory, and we will be able to worship God freely, and that the Messiah will have a religious component to him, but primarily will be kind of a military genius or general leader, and then a political king. So that's kind of the expectation that first century Jews almost certainly had about when Messiah comes, what Messiah will be. He will be a human, not God, and he will act in military and political ways to win us our freedom. So that leads to a very strange thing that happens in the Synoptic Gospels. And we're going to see evidences of this first in Mark, but it's in all three of them. And it's sometimes called this idea of the messianic secret. Okay, so you should write that term down. So I wrote it here. Jesus tells people not to tell what he has done or who he is. Okay, what does that mean? So the messianic secret. So a very strange thing that you'll notice, even if you're just kind of casually reading any of the Synoptic Gospels, but certainly in Mark, is that as Jesus goes along, he will perform a miracle. One of the very first miracles he performs in Mark is he heals a leper. Right, this man with leprosy comes and calls out to him while Jesus is walking down the road, Lord, if you are willing, make me clean. And Jesus is moved with compassion. He reaches out and touches the man, and we're going to talk more about that particular story. And he's made clean. He's healed. He performs a healing miracle for this leper. But then he immediately tells him, now don't tell anyone what has happened to you. Right? This remarkable thing. Like you have this disease that has destined you to this life of isolation and loneliness and pain and death, eventual death, and now it's gone. Like I have completely healed you of this disease, but I want you to keep it a secret. Right? And the messianic secret is that Jesus does that over and over again. He will perform miracles, he will cast out demons, and people will be stunned by what he does. And then he'll say, I don't want you to tell anyone. Like, please keep it a secret. And usually, almost always, these people ignore him and go and tell everybody. So it doesn't really work, the messianic secret. But you have this sense over and over again that why doesn't Jesus want to get the news out, right? Like, he doesn't have a very good PR plan, if George Fox has the Be Known campaign and Stand Tall, and that kind of stuff. Jesus needs better PR. Right, because it seems like the stuff that really ought to put him on the map and make him famous, he's interested in trying to hide for some reason. Like, why is he so secretive? Why is the Messiah secretive about his identity, particularly? And scholars aren't sure. No one's exactly sure what Jesus is up to here, but it seems as if the most likely explanation for this messianic secret is this idea that Jesus knows that he has come to be the Messiah, and he knows that he has come in a spiritual sense to be the deliverer not only of Israel but of all humanity, but he's not come to do what they're expecting. Right? Think back to the messianic secret. If they're expecting a revolution, they're expecting a military takeover, like somebody that's going to stand up in the middle of the temple and kill a bunch of Romans and call everyone to follow suit, and there'll be a bloodbath, and then Rome will leave or all be killed, and then you will have a Jewish religious state with Jesus sitting on the throne. He's not going to do that, right? So particularly in Mark, no, actually I'm going to suffer. If you want to follow me, if you want me to be your king, you need to be willing to die. We're not going to kill Rome, actually. Actually Rome is going to kill me. That I am going to suffer and die rather than, triumph and be victorious. And that I am not the kind of Messiah you're looking for. I'm not the kind of Messiah you expect. And I don't think you can handle that. Right? There was this movie, A Few Good Men. It's an old Jack Nicholson, Tom Cruise movie. But in the climactic scene, Jack Nicholson is on trial, and Tom Cruise is trying to get him to confess to this crime that he's committed. And Tom Cruise says, I want the truth. And Jack Nicholson is this angry old kind of army colonel. And he goes, you want the truth? You can't handle the truth. And he kind of starts yelling at Tom Cruise, you can't handle the truth. And in a sense, that seems to be what's going on with the messianic secret. Like Jesus is kind of saying, I am the Messiah, but you can't handle the truth of what that means. Like, you can't handle what I'm going to do, because what I'm going to do is the opposite of what you want. Like, I'm not going to win a military victory for you. I'm not going to kick out the Romans. In fact, I'm going to die on a cross. And I don't think you can handle that. So I'm going to kind of keep it secret throughout most of my life. And at the very end, in Mark and in other Gospels, he'll start to tell his closest friends. And sure enough, we'll see that they kind of reject that. Like, absolutely not. There's no way we're going to let you do that. Right? So the Messianic secret, regardless of what it means or why he does it, is this tendency in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, not in John. We'll see, which is a very curious thing. Jesus is the opposite of the Messianic secret in John. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, particularly in Mark, he is very kind of hesitant for people to talk about his identity. And sometimes people will guess, like, surely you are the Son of God, or surely you are the one sent from God. And he'll like, oh, keep that quiet. Don't tell anyone what you just figured out. Like, you're onto something, but I don't want other people to know that. I want it to remain a secret. Okay, so the Messianic expectation is a new idea in this lecture. The Messianic secret also is a new idea. Okay, so one more topic that the Gospels address is this idea of Christology. Okay, so that's a theological term. It doesn't appear in the Gospels at all, but Christology, and I'm going to kind of write it out here. Christology is the study of, or the thinking about, who is Jesus? What is Jesus's identity? Right? So I mentioned a few minutes ago that Christ, the term Christ, is not a name. Like, it's not Jesus's last name, it's his title. It's his title. It's a statement about who Christians believe Jesus to have been. Sherwood is my last name, Steve Sherwood. If I were Steve the Great, or Steve the Mediocre, or Steve the really pretty crappy, like, those would be titles or descriptors, right? Alexander the Great is kind of a title. Julius Caesar, that kind of, so we have titles that sometimes get confused with last names. But Christ is not a last name, it's a title. So Christology is when Christians or biblical scholars think about, what does this book of the Bible say about Jesus's role or title or identity? And so often it will be said that a particular gospel will either have high or low Christology. I don't know why I wrote a high and low. Those are pretty simple terms. So a high Christology, a thing that Christians believe, and this is one of the stranger, I think, beliefs about Christianity. I fully affirm it, but I recognize if you're looking at Christianity from the outside, this is one of the harder things to wrap your mind around, or maybe on a concept that requires the most faith. So Christians believe that Jesus is fully God, but also fully human, right? That he's not God who comes to earth and pretends to be a human. Like, if you read Greek or Roman mythology, sometimes the gods come to earth and disguise themselves as humans and walk around. Maybe they have sex with some human women, or get in some fights and kill some people or whatnot. They play at being a human, but really they're always just gods, right? And they kind of are able to hide or masquerade as humans, but they're not. That's not what Christians believe. At the same time, sometimes you'll see really good, virtuous people as being described as they were so good, so kind, so virtuous, they were godlike. Like Gandhi sometimes is described this way, right? That Gandhi was such a good man, it was almost as if he achieved godlike status by his virtue, his moral superiority to others. That's also not what Christians believe. So Christians do not believe that Jesus was a God who just masqueraded as a human for a few years and then went back to heaven. And they also don't believe that he was just a human who was better than us. Like, he's not just an upgraded version of me and you who's so much better, it's kind of like he's God. Like, in a very strange and mysterious way, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, Christians believe that Jesus is everything God is and everything we are together. That Jesus is fully God and fully human, right? So that's this idea of the incarnation, or God in the flesh, in a real human life and a real human being. Okay, having said that, how does that work, right? How does that fit together? And so sometimes books of the Bible will be said to have either high Christology or low Christology. So what that means, if a gospel has a high Christology, it means in the balance of, like, Jesus is God, Jesus is human, which one does the gospel emphasize more? Right? And one of the things we're going to see, one of the differences of the Gospel of John, is that John is said to have a high Christology. In John, you have a whole lot of statements where Jesus is drawing comparisons to himself and God. And he calls God his Father. Like, if you want to see God, if you want to know what God is like, look at me. Like, I'll show you the Father. And you see God the Father through my actions. Well, that's Jesus elevating himself very, very close to who God is, right? So John would be a gospel that has high Christology, right? Like in John, the emphasis is, yes, he's human, but boy, he really had some unique relationship to God that is different than you and I, different than most humans have. In the Synoptics, it tends to be the reverse. In the Synoptics, what you get a lot of is Jesus' humanity. Now, there are hints that Jesus is somehow uniquely related to God in ways that you and I could never dream of being. So the Synoptics don't deny the idea that Jesus is God in the flesh, but if all you had was Mark, all you had was Matthew, you would have to work pretty hard to get the fully God, fully man thing. Right? If all you had were the Synoptic Gospels, it might be tempting to think Jesus was a human who just somehow related to God more purely than us. Like, I want to stress, I'm not saying that any of the Synoptics deny the God-like nature of Jesus, that Jesus was God in the flesh. In fact, like, Emmanuel comes from the Gospel of Matthew, this term God in the flesh. But if you read the Gospels as a whole, the Synoptics, you get much more the human side of Jesus. You see Jesus doing very human things, getting tired, being frustrated, weeping, feeling sorrow, things like that. So one way to think about it, John has a higher Christology. The Synoptics have a lower Christology. Again, John does not deny Jesus' humanity. The Synoptics don't deny Jesus' divinity. But if when you look at them just by themselves, in John, you get a whole lot of Jesus and his relationship to God the Father. In the Synoptics, you get a whole bit of how Jesus is a person like us, and how he can relate to and he experienced life in ways that we experience it. So you get a little bit of an emphasis upon his humanity. Okay? So those are some significant ideas about just kind of framing the Gospels a little bit, and then also kind of framing some ideas around the Messianic secret, Messianic expectation, and high and low Christology. I want to take just a few minutes and start looking at Mark just a tiny bit, and we probably won't get very far, but I want to get to one idea that we've alluded to already. So, as I stated, Mark is very unique in the Gospels in that we have nothing about Jesus' origins, right? We don't get that he came from Abraham. In Luke, we get this idea that he comes from Adam, and there's this list of his ancestors. John even starts out with this little prologue saying, I want to tell you about this Jesus, and he was the Logos. He was connected to God from the very beginning. Mark just jumps right in. Like, first jumps in with this guy, John the Baptist, who's kind of a prophet foretelling Jesus is coming. And then, boom, immediately within the first chapter, here's Jesus as an adult, and he starts performing miracles. He starts gathering friends around him, and the miracles start, and then he's off and running. Right? So like we said, Mark doesn't waste any time, but he does clue us in, right? Kind of, if you've ever watched The Office or television shows where, there's action happening over here, there's the story, And then every, scene or two, like the main characters come and just talk to you, talk to the camera. Mark sort of does the same thing, right? He steps out of character and goes, I'm about to tell you a story where no one in the story is going to understand what's going on. Everyone's going to be confused, even at the end, even at the resurrection. People are going to be like, what the crap? Like, what just happened? But I'm going to tell you, first sentence, this is the story about Jesus. And who was he? He was the Christ, right? Later on, we figured it out. At the time, everyone was lost. But here's who he is. He's the Christ. He's the Son of God. So the story jumps in. We have this little prelude with John the Baptist, and then we begin to have miracles. So I want to look at this, not the very first miracle, but the first healing miracle that appears in the Gospels. And this is from Gospel of Mark chapter 1. So I'm going to read this short little story, and then we're going to emphasize one point about it, and then we'll kind of wrap up for the day with that. So this is reading out of Mark 1. So a man with leprosy came to Jesus, and he begged him on his knees, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus was indignant or moved with compassion. He reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him, and the leper was clean. And Jesus sent him on his way at once with a stern warning. "See that you don't tell anyone what has happened to you, but go and show yourself to the priest and offer sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." And instead, the man went out and began to speak freely and spread the news. Okay, so like I said, we have the messianic secret there. Jesus performs a miracle, tells them not to tell anyone. The man completely ignores him and goes and tells everyone. But that's not what I want to highlight in this story. What I want to highlight is a very subtle, this is a short story, right? We talked about pericope in the last video. This is a very short pericope. Like there's not a ton, this isn't a very long scene, right? But something really significant happens just kind of subtly in it. A man with leprosy came to Jesus and said, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Okay, so that's a key point to this story. So we've alluded to this earlier in class in the intertestamental period, but really want to highlight it now. Is a huge concept. I mean, think about this time of the coronavirus, right? Where clean and unclean is, like wash your hands all the time. Don't touch doorknobs. Don't touch things that other people have touched because they're unclean. They might have the virus on them. And you want to stay as separate and clean and removed from contamination as possible. Like take that and kind of crank it even up a little higher, turn up the heat on that a little bit, and then have that be every day of your life, right? In some ways, that's kind of first century Judaism with this idea of clean and unclean, right? That to follow God is to keep yourself clean, and that everywhere you go, there are things to make you unclean. Gentiles, certain foods, unclean foods, blood, human fluids of any kind, right? All sorts of things that if you come into contact with them, oh shoot, now you have to go and be purified by a priest. You have to be washed and go through a ceremony to be clean, because keeping yourself pure and clean is ultra important. And that if you were unclean, you're kind of cast out, both cast out of society, but also cast out of God, like cast out of communion or covenant relationship with God. And so clean and unclean is this ultra important concept. And clean, as powerful as it is really vulnerable in first century Judaism. Like it takes, like imagine a swimming pool and you drop like one drop of dye into it. So it's this beautiful clear swimming pool, one drop of blue dye or red dye or something. Well, the entire pool is unclean. We have to drain the whole thing, right? You can't be mostly clean. You have to be totally clean. And all it takes is a tiny touch. All it takes is one little drop, and everything is ruined, right? So one brushing up against a Gentile at the marketplace, you're unclean. One touching of somebody who's got a hemorrhage or is a woman that is menstruating, you're unclean, right? So clean is super important, but it's really fragile, really, really fragile. And lepers, which is leprosy is a skin disease. It's caused by a neurological problem, but your skin begins to kind of fall apart. And so you've got lesions, you've got boils and wounds, and they're oozing fluids. And so once you're diagnosed with leprosy, you are unclean the rest of your life. Right? So to be a leper is to have this horrible physical disease, but it's also to live outside of Jewish society. Right? Lepers would have to live in the hillsides or hide in caves or in the woods. And if other, healthy Jews came upon them, it was lepers' job to hide from them. Right? Like you can't, in fact, sometimes they would have to wear a bell, around their necks, kind of like to announce that they were coming, that you would hear a bell coming and like, oh, there's lepers, there's unclean coming into our midst. Or they would have to announce, I'm a leper, I'm unclean, hide yourselves. Like, could you imagine walking down the streets of your community, walking across the quad, moving through the Canyon Commons, and everywhere you go, people hide from you because you're disgusting, right? Like who you are is repulsive to them, and they have to no one can come in contact with you. Your family, your relatives, people you know and care about, they can't put their arm around you, shake your hand, give you a hug. Again, kind of like right now in the coronavirus, don't have contact with anyone, right? You have to stay clean. So this man wants to be healed from his disease, but he's also wants to re-enter society. Like, if you are willing, Jesus, you can make me clean. And so Jesus is a Jew, right? Jesus is very aware of this clean and unclean thing. But what does Jesus do? Immediately, he reached out his hand and touched the man and said, I am willing, be clean. Right? Now, Jesus has all kinds of power. We're going to see later on in the Gospels, this Gospel and others, Jesus heals people in all kinds of ways. He doesn't have to touch this man. He could reach like, hey, you're disgusting. Why don't you stay on the other side of the road? I'll throw some of my healing power over to you and make you clean from a distance. Because, quite frankly, you gross me out, and I really don't want to be associated with your filth, your uncleanliness, and I want to stay pure as a Jew. Jesus could have done that, right? But that's not what he does. He reaches out and he touches the man. And I think there's 2 points with that, and this is where we're going to end for the morning. One is, just imagine kind of the social effect this has on this man. Right? Like, not only is he healed of his physical disease, but for however long he's been a leper, he has not had any human contact. Right? All he sees of people is their backs as they run to hide from him. And not only does Jesus listen to him and look at him, but he reaches out and touches him. Right? Can you imagine if you've perhaps gone years without human touch, and then here is Jesus reaching out and touching you, maybe putting his arm on your shoulder, or touching your head, or something like that to heal you. So just emotionally, I think this has to be a profound event. But this a spiritual thing is happening here too. Jesus kind of reverses the whole clean unclean dynamic, right? In Jewish culture, clean is in this little vulnerable pocket, and all it takes is one little touch of unclean and everything's ruined. Right? But Jesus, it's the opposite. Right? Jesus reaches out and touches the unclean thing. And instead of being contaminated by it, his purity spreads to the unclean man. Right? For Jesus, clean isn't a vulnerable thing. It's unclean that it's vulnerable. Every time, so we're going to see throughout the Gospels, Jesus comes into contact with impurity, with sin, sinners, unclean people, whether by disease or by their actions or their moral standing. And when he interacts with them, they become pure like him. He spreads his cleanliness, his purity to those that are unclean, and he's not infected by it. He's not infected by it. And in the next video, I'm gonna tell a little personal story about this concept. But I think we often get this. I think we often live kind of like the Pharisees, in a way that we're very concerned about clean and unclean, and we hide ourselves. Whereas Jesus doesn't feel any like, you can't contaminate me. I am pure. I'm pure on the inside, and that comes out of me. And when I come into contact with people, they become like I am, rather than the opposite. Okay, so we'll do more in future videos. Please, if you've got questions, comments, email those to me, and we'll fold those into new material. All right, thank you very much.